So in front of you right now is the phylogeny, the family tree of the animals. It is the diversity of the nervous system, with the exception of perhaps periphery, the sponges, toward the top. Despite this diversity, the overwhelmingly preferred model within the behavioral sciences is here, the vertebrates, which includes ourselves. As the mind continues to diversify into unimaginable forms in the world and perhaps the universe around us. So if we wish to understand the mind, we should look beyond the vertebrate model to other forms of thought entirely. And for this reason, I have chosen the octopus as my model organism. It has been for over 500 million years that the octopus has been evolving cognitive complexity in parallel to that of vertebrates, but has done so through entirely divergent neural architecture. Most of the octopus's nervous system exists within its arms as a distributed network. This allows it to offload a great deal of computation from its brain into its arms, and this allows it to process massive amounts of information in parallel, including the information necessary to control the infinite degrees of freedom of its arms. They don't really have fixed joints like we do, as well as the massive amount of sensory information available from their suckers. This is the morphology of the sucker. It can orient, and the spherical muscle you see in the middle, when contracted, will activate the adhesion mechanism if a proper seal is made. This is what the innervation of the sucker looks like. On the face of the sucker disc is where you'll have mechanical receptors. Those are dedicated to processing the shape of the substrate that's attached to, as well as assess the integrity of the adhesion mechanism. Along the outer rim, where it's exposed to the most number of dissolved chemicals, is naturally the chemoreceptive system. There are tens of thousands of both chemical and mechanical receptors in each sucker. To put that into perspective, each one of your fingertips has a few hundred mechanical receptors. So it's a lot of information that these suckers are processing, and the way they're able to do that is that each one has been delegated a cluster of neurons that serves as a local sensory and motor computation center called a ganglion. These ganglia are among a chain that projects toward the brain. So the brain is where the 8 arms converge. And at the base of each arm, there is a neural ring that serves to unite them, that serves as a means by which the arms can communicate with each other without sending information through the brain. What you see here is a cross-section with the neurons stained in black. Like I said, each sucker has its own ganglion, and each one of those ganglia, while it projects to each sucker, shares information likewise with the arm musculature surrounding it. So each ganglia processes the information from the local sucker, from the local musculature, and as well controls that segment of the musculature and the sucker itself. Most of this information doesn't make it to the brain at all. The brain receives but a very highly abstracted sense of what's going on out in the world, and will respond with a very generalized motor plan that will get specified based on this very densely innervated sensory field. Here is a simplified schematic of the cross-section of the arm. In a way, the octopus has sent its mind out into the environment to meet it halfway. So it's a very different way of thinking about the world. So what we're doing is we're using behavioral tracking to characterize how the suckers and the arms are collectively acquiring, integrating, and responding to information in the environment, which I'm going to walk you guys through right now. So from the level of the suckers, what we can do is provide an arm with a simple puzzle or a task by which it's able to extract some food, and we can simply characterize the strategies that it's using to do this. What becomes immediately apparent to us is that once a sucker makes contact with a stimulus, it immediately recruits its immediate neighbor to joining it. What you see here is the segments lighting up proportionately to their angular speed during the course of this behavior. So this is consistent with research that was done before me. And what it is showing us is that once a sucker makes contact with the stimulus, it is recruiting the next sucker over to bend toward the source of that stimulus. Once it makes contact with that stimulus, it will do the same thing for the next sucker until it propagates the signal down the length of the arm. And again, the information acquired from the stimulus is highly abstracted on its way to the brain. This dot is highlighting the different parts of the arm or the different segments, and it's showing, based on color coordination, how the other segments are correlated with that one in terms of its angular speed. What becomes apparent is that there is, accordingly, this symmetry around the original point of contact, showing both distal and proximal recruitment of suckers, and toward the tip of the arm where the arm is actually wrapping around the stimulus. What you see here is how the strategy actually changed over time. We recognize that there was two strategies that the arm was mainly using. One was really the arm feeling around in the water column, and the other one, as a direct consequence of the mechanism I just described to you, goes straight for the wall and starts following the wall, like you might amaze if you wanted to get out of it, interestingly enough. The highlighted images are when there actually is no food in the box. And what we started to notice was that wall following was overwhelmingly preferred in these cases. So in the lack of chemical information, in other words. For the next task, we made it a little bit more interesting by adding a texture on one side. By the way, you're looking at this sideways, but I couldn't bear to show you guys a vertical video. So this showed a very similar pattern, but it was particularly strong in the direction of the texture itself, as you can see. So what was the arm doing during this time? It was literally just feeling up the texture. So what seems to be the case is that the arm uses the chemical and mechanical composition of the environment as a framework upon which to behave. The brain doesn't need to choose where the arm bends. That's the environment doing that. This is probably an intrinsic property of the soft-bodied intelligence. It's using the environment as a computational resource. And mechanical novelty is a particularly strong reference by which it's able to do that in the case of the texture. A drawback of this different kind of intelligence is that sometimes there's not always a consensus, and the arm will play tug-of-war with itself. But there are drawbacks to our kind of intelligence too, but that's going to be a talk for another time, perhaps. All right, let's reorient ourselves. So what this mechanism allows it to do is it maximizes both the amount of control that the arm has over a given stimulus, as well as the amount of information gathered from that stimulus. So this is particularly important for a particularly interesting stimuli, as well as stimuli that might be struggling for its life. So if you ever feel an octopus grabbing onto you, don't struggle. So what's actually happening at the systems level when this is happening? Well, when one sucker grabs on to an object, it sends a signal to the brain, again, a very abstracted signal. But then as the next sucker over also gains access to that signal, or to that stimulus, that signal is going to be a lot stronger until it reaches a certain threshold, at which point the brain is recruited. The brain is the node by which the arms vie for control over the others in a winner-take-all fashion. At that point, the brain will update the motor strategy of the arms, and again, that information that is in the peripheral nervous system will be used to specify that information, or specify that motor output to the environment at that time. So we can track this as well, and the way we're able to do this is by looking at synchronous versus asynchronous movement in the arms, because what synchronous movement will tell us is that it's not the arms really doing this, it's that the brain is intervening to be able to update the motor plan of the arms based on one of those stimuli. This broad motor plan generated from the brain can be very dramatic. In this case, you can see how all the arms have been told to reach at the same time. And again, it's the information that never makes it to the brain at all that is being used to locally modify that behavior to fit the conditions at that time. And we can track that too. For now. So we are also seeing this other kind of recruitment strategy. I've talked about sucker to sucker. I've talked about arm to brain. We can see that the arm will actually recruit its neighbors. But this happens in a lot more turbulent environments because obviously the arms from all sides are now getting a lot more information. It's not a simple just like one object, one behavior kind of task. So you saw it there. You can see it again here. And it's not hard to watch. I've had them described to me as living lava lamps. Okay, so what do we think is happening here? Through the ganglia, so a separate pathway, and then through the ring, which is called the interbrachial commissure, which is a bit of a mouthful, a signal will be sent to the neighboring arms. Those arms will actually join the one that sent the signal to begin with, and then now the representation of that stimulus now being handled by 3 arms will have the maximized amount of representation in the nervous system, and that will recruit the brain. So, characterizing these strategies, these recruitment strategies, sucker to sucker, arm to arm, and arm to brain, will give us a sense for how the suckers and arms are collectively acquiring, integrating, and responding to information in the environment, and to what extent the brain is involved at all. Our methods, starting with 2-dimensional tracking, have become more sophisticated. Now we move into 3-dimensional tracking. Now, for the first time ever, we can completely characterize the movement patterns of the octopus and its arms in all their infinite degrees of freedom, allowing us to characterize the strategies that the octopus is using to coordinate its distributed mind. Characterizing the computational strategies that these alternative models of intelligence are using will give us a perspective on the forms of intelligence we can expect from worlds beyond our own. So this was obviously a team effort. I couldn't possibly do this alone. So I'd like to thank my research assistants, everyone in my lab. I'd like to thank the University of Washington Institute for Neural Engineering, who has funded me and is currently funding 2 of my research assistants, Friday Harbor Laboratories, which is where I'm currently doing my research for the summer, and of course, University of Washington Astrobiology program. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here at all. And thank you all.
Thank you, Dominic. Do we have any questions?
I didn't get to comment on this. So, when you read anthropological literature, there's a lot of explanations for why we have such big brains. The expensive tissue hypothesis or sexual selection. And I'm wondering in the octopus community, what hypotheses have been put forward as to explain why the octopus has such a big brain?
So I'm going to repeat the question just to contextualize it. So what did select for the octopus's brain as opposed to like our brain, right?
Or as opposed to other invertebrate brains that aren't as big as the octopus brains.
Ah, yes, okay. So that's a really relevant question, and we don't have all the answers. We weren't there during their evolution, nor were we here for our evolution. And our intelligence was selected by our environment. We don't have a generalized intelligence. We have a repurposed intelligence that seems more generalized than what it was probably used best for at the time. If I were to speculate, the octopus probably had extractive foraging as its most overwhelmingly selective pressure. So it had to find and extract food. And so that's why you get this wall following. This is why you get this preference for novelty, for instance. The arms are sampling, and even with the brain removed, or even with the arm removed, this exploration strategy that you guys saw in front of you happens. So it is embedded within the nervous system of the arms, and it will activate even without the brain at all. But it's important because we have with us the consequences of the selective pressure for our intelligence, as do they, and as will whatever evolves to intelligence anywhere out there in the universe. Is that a fair answer?
There are lots of other vertebrates who also have that living strategy whose brains are much smaller than the octopus.
That's true. Yeah, but they figured it out in a very different way. The size of the brain doesn't really matter.
Okay.
I like to make the point that more important than the question, how intelligent are they, is how are they intelligent? And we can ask that question to anything that's out there.
Somewhat related, but one of the paradoxes, well, one of the things that's often presented as a paradox of octopus intelligence is their relatively short lifespan, like some species only 1 or 2 years. So I was wondering, in terms of memory, with this distributed intelligence, is there evidence that the arms maintain some kind of memory of their environment, and how long that persists and how that's transmitted?
If we can show that, it would change the field forever.
All right,
That was a
thanks.
good question.
That was a lot of fun. There's a lot of other cephalopods besides octopi.
Mm-hmm.
How similar or different are they, given that they have completely different lifestyles?
Yeah, so their mode of lifestyle is very different, as you mentioned. In terms of their neural anatomy, what you'll get is that the peripheral nervous system for the squid and cuttlefish is not as distributed as that for the octopus, but the brain itself is more distributed, which is interesting. In the case of squid, you'll actually have more sophisticated optic lobes, which is something I did not talk about. So it's supposedly suggesting that the eyes are more sophisticated than that of the octopus, which is interesting because the octopus during the day is primarily a visual hunter. And this probably has something to do with the squid's pelagic lifestyle, so they live in the water column. They probably need to see farther than they feel.
All right. Thank you. Let's thank again all our speakers.
Thank you all.